We begin today's program with a closer look at China's idol culture. It's no news that some fans go to great lengths to support their pop stars, waiting for hours just to catch a glimpse, spending a fortune to buy concert ticket, tirelessly defending their idol on social media. But now many are asking, has celebrity worship gone too far, at least in some cases?
An earthquake in China's entertainment business. 30-year-old Chinese-Canadian singer Chris Wu was arrested for sexual misconduct. Alleged victims include minors. And this has set off a storm on Chinese social media. The pop star has always been surrounded by fans. When he was arrested, some die-hard followers even went extremes, calling for his release. The country's cyberspace administration says it will improve the management of the fan circle online and limit extreme fan activities and behavior among minors. The future of Chris Wu is still uncertain. If convicted and sentenced in China, deportation to Canada likely awaits.
The moment of reckoning comes when certain fans posted on social media that they plan to break from jail their idol, a hugely popular male celebrity in detention on suspected rape. Chinese authorities then issued the statements about curbing the barbaric growth of pan-entertainment and keeping the influence of capital in check. So, is idol worship an organic adoration or manipulated emotions? How can fan culture be shaped into a quote-unquote healthy one? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on the topic, we are joined from New York, Joanna Cheng, intercultural film critic and filmmaker. In Beijing, Han Hua, media and communication consultant. And also in Beijing, Teng Jimeng, a freelance cultural commentator, professor also from Beijing Foreign Studies University. Welcome to the program. Well, this is quite a big phenomenon in China, Chris Wu, and what he apparently has committed. Ms. Han, what is your take about this incident and its spillover effect?
Well, I personally think that is the ultimate result of the fan culture, because the fan culture in the recent years has grown to be, actually, it's not a promising culture or social phenomenon, but rather a big problem, big issues for the whole society, starting from the teenagers to be the fans of celebrities. Those teenagers are far away from the from the mainstream media, and they crave for attentions from the society, from schools, but they choose to use a shortcut to be the fans of celebrity. And secondly, this is the result of the capital market, who becoming the driving force of the fan culture booming, and it is the ultimate review and the lessons to be drawn from the bad results of the fan culture.
Interesting. And let me go to you, Ms. Cheng. Your thoughts about this Chris Wu's incident?
I think Chris Wu, as a very young celebrity, is hitting the bottom. If Chris Wu is in fact abusing a young female, if not underage or young female, and he indeed need to be corrected. And there is a worldwide morality pandemic in addition to this coronavirus.
Right.
So this is very disheartening what's happening.
Professor Tang, your take?
Well, once again, I would echo my fellow panelists by saying that this is the result of an ongoing market economy, and perhaps in a very negative sense. If you look at the phenomenon right now, you can see the whole fanfare, the whole actually phenomenon is driven by this very capital market, and also a depreciation of humanity and perhaps degeneration, morally speaking, on the part of this young fan culture. Right now, I think it is high time that the Chinese cultural authorities should crack down on this very fan culture, because it leads young people astray. I mean, it leads young people to the selfish, self-destructive, self-glory.
You know, when you talk about the fan culture, it's very interesting. It's been with us for, as long as we have human being, right? You have admirations for someone that you feel that is more admirable. But the question really is the degree of it and what is fan culture really is about. And what it has led the young people to do. I think that probably is the key here. Ms. Han, let's focus on Chris Wu's case first before we move on to the fan culture. Now, there's accusation, one after another, against him about not even sexual harassment, but also date rape. Ms. Han, of course, the case is still under investigation. We'll have to see the final result. But when a popular star related to accusations like this, and was not one, but rather a series of accusations, what does it really say about, at least the fanfare created around him?
First thing first, I think, as you put it already, and there are so many news reports about that, there is not one case accusation, but there will be a series of accusations around him. And there might be more serious accusations from him to more celebrities in the circle. So I think when Beijing police announced these accusations, that means this already touched a certain level of bottom of the problem in the society, especially the problem around the celebrity. So Chris Wu is the case in point at this crucial time when people on one hand are coping and dealing with the pandemic and try to get the economy back to normal, hopefully. And on the other side, when China is entering into a new stage of development, opening up, and to get the livelihood and the welfare not only physically, but mentally welfare to be upgraded to a new level. So this is a crucial junction period when Chris Wu's case broke.
This Asian pop culture and fan culture has been with us for quite some time. How it has reached where it is today, I think that is an interesting question. Certainly needs to be further thought. Professor Tang.
The issues right now we are discussing is quite a universal one. I mean, a popular one among those within this very pop cultural circles. For example, the K-pop communities in the Far East Asians, or perhaps in the world. The K-pop culture has been so influential over the past decade. I mean, ever since the late 1990s and perhaps the 2000s, even in North America, you felt the power of K-pop. But K-pop also brings forth issues like this. In fact, it was also connected to pop culture back in the 1960s in the United States. I mean, drug abuse, raping and the raping of groupies and these young followers have been always popular and also discussed and debated in the community for quite a long time. And so Chris Wu is not an isolated case in this very point. He actually, in fact, inherited the legacy, the very negative legacy of this very pop culture and also the fan culture. And so, like I said, I mean, it's high time that we address this very negative side of the fan culture and deal with it and confront it. And in fact, we need to speak to this very issue nationwide. There should be a nationwide debate about this.
Yeah, Ms. Cheng, of course, it is not just the idols, so-called popular idols in China that's running into problems or in Far East, but also, recent stories about Britney Spears, of course, in a very different nature, certainly have shown many of these so-called young idols are very vulnerable about themselves and also might be very vulnerable toward creating vulnerability in others. So how do you see, the fan culture worldwide, and does that, after decades of incidents, wouldn't that provide much food for thoughts for all of us?
Chris Wu is not an isolated case, and although he is young, he represents a special interest group who are actually abusing their popularity, and the so-called celebrity, they lost their moral compass. If this incident, which is not isolated one, he represents, I think, a section in society who is derailing from being good. So they are actually setting a very bad example for young people.
Ms. Han, how do you see this, but the commercial side of it, the so-called capital-related side of it, of this issue?
This is certainly a huge loss of the capital markets, of the driving forces behind the Chris Wu, and not only Chris Wu, the whole celebrity circle and the celebrity business economy, a fan economy, or we can say that. I try to echo Professor Teng here that there was scandals around Chris Wu and other celebrities years ago, actually, and the scandals were covered up by mostly the capital driving forces behind. So that was the huge problem. That was the issue, and that was the huge issue, the Beijing police and also the collective joint efforts by the government, by the other associations, by the other agencies want to crack down this time to make this determination. And this also echoes the grand picture, which China is becoming the definite #2 largest economy in the world. So part of this one of the largest economy is the economy of celebrity, economy of fan culture. We cannot say this is the natural flow, but if we don't have any structure cracking down of this bad direction, then it might be becoming a bigger problem, social issues included in the future.
Right. We all know that Chris Wu has had certain kinds of commercial deals with different huge brands, including international ones. We also know there are quite a number of entertainment companies, for example, reality shows, music shows, TV dramas, movies. It's only natural that entertainment companies work with the pop stars. However, in this case, all the companies were trying to cut ties with him immediately after the news came out. So it also shows, in a way, how, it gives another aspect of how to look at the issue, how celebrities are being shaped, and how, in fact, vulnerable they are, however, by the capital, but at the same time, they should be responsible for the capital and the society. That's a very interesting question. It's a two-way street in a way, Professor Tang.
You're right. You're very right. I think celebrities are people of greater responsibility. And in terms of responsibilities, it reminds me of a very famous remark made by Brad Pitt, this very big Hollywood star. And at one point in an interview, he said, as the most beautiful boy in my class, I realized I have greater responsibility. And so a celebrity, a celebrity should be actually given more social responsibilities in shaping not just himself, but also the culture, the fans around him, so that they created the very positive force sociologically. And as Joanne has pointed out so correctly, celebrities are the very barometers of public morality. And so in Chris Wu's case, he is supposed to be the barometer. He's supposed to be the flagship pole that we all look up to. And in this sense, Chris Wu failed to live up to that very expectation. It is his own personal kind of a wrongdoing, but at the same time, it is also this very culture, this very market, this very commercial business that destroys such a very hopeful young man. I still remember that he's acting in Mr. Six, directed by Feng Xiaogang, so very impressive. I'm so deeply impressed by his performance, but then at the same time, he should be a double-faced character. We should actually see more, see behind that very young face.
So, Ms. Han, please help me to understand, what about the companies that ESG these days are so important for companies, not only in the market, but also in front of the public eyes? How do you see the performances of companies and expectations for companies for the future?
I think they should bear in mind that the celebrities, they could be the representatives of the culture, the pop culture, but they are not a representation of social morality. The social morality needs to be built on, and they need to tell their celebrities, the people they are running the business on behalf of, to be a good person in the first place, and to don't get lost in front of the capital, in front of the monetization, promising future of these celebrities. I think this is the bottom line of being not only a good person, but as Professor Teng just pointed out, to take some social responsibilities, because they have so many followers in this special economy, which the economy is a two-way street, just as you pointed out. It's not only you are creating a personal icon or intellectual property, but you are also getting the vulnerability of this personal IP. So you need to take care of that, cherish that, and to create the positive economy rather than the negative impact over the teenagers.
Interesting point, Professor Teng.
I mean, yes, I mean, corporations must bear in mind that they have what they call a CSR, the corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility should be the very guiding principle in conducting businesses in a world of changing and in a world of challenges. So in this case, Chris Wu sounded an alarm for these corporations, large corporations, small corporations. They should emphasize one principle and one principle only: transparency and also morality when you try to cultivate this very public icon.
There are certainly different insights and perspectives about this story, and I'm sure there will be further scrutiny against, first of all, this person involved, and also the fan culture related to him. But on the other hand, it is always healthy to have young people admiring their idols, and everybody has their own choices in that regard. For that, I want to thank the three of you for joining us: Joanna Cheng, Han Hua, and Teng Jimeng. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And you're watching World Insight. Coming up, inflation and export. The latest number about the Chinese economy. A well-respected American economist helps us make sense of the numbers from his courtyard in Beijing. Next. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. How is China's economy doing? Let's take a look at some of the latest data. In July, China's inflation, measured with the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, rose by 1% year-on-year. Rising CPI traditionally suggests worsening inflation. Meanwhile, on the trade side, export growth slowed in July to 19.3% growth rate, which is attributed to the Delta-led resurgence of COVID-19 cases worldwide. So what's the outlook on the Chinese economy for the rest of the year 2021? I asked Michael Pettis, a well-respected American economist, at his Hutong office in the heart of Beijing. Professor Pettis, what a pleasure to see you once again.
It's a pleasure to see you, Tian Wei.
Living in the middle of downtown Beijing, I'm sure you have a real sense of how the Chinese economy is doing. What are your neighbors saying?
Well, I have a sense of how this part of Beijing is doing, and it seems to be doing pretty lively.
Yeah, like what?
Lots of people are out, although I've noticed that in recent days, once again, more people are wearing masks and more people are checking your phones before they let you into the shops, etc. So I guess we're going through a little bit of a resurgence, which I hope will end fairly soon.
But right opposite, not far from your place, is exactly the bar place of Beijing, huh? Were people still consuming before this round of Delta variant concern?
Yeah, many of the places were quite full, and you know, I work a lot with musicians, and they've been doing tours that have almost all sold out. So for a while, things were going very well. I think already we're starting to get cancellations because of the Delta variant. So we're all hoping that that's no more than a few weeks, and then we go back to normal.
Well, you could argue Beijing might not be typical in terms of the Chinese economy as a whole, but this could tell a little bit story about how much drive is there for consumption among the common Chinese folks.
Well, the problem is not that the Chinese people don't like to consume. They do, and in fact, among young Chinese, there's a concern that consumption levels may be too high. The problem that China faces is not so much that people won't consume, but rather that people retain a low share of what they produce. So in the US, for example, if you produce 100 kwai worth of goods, typically you get directly or indirectly about 80. And in Europe, you might get 70, 75. In Japan, you might get around 60. In China, you get around 50. And as a result, you can't consume a large share of what you produce. And that's the consumption problem in China. It's not that the Chinese don't like to consume. Like everybody else, they do like to consume. It's that they retain too low a share of GDP.
That's one thing. The other thing is about how much are the Chinese households spending every month, for example, and what are the percentage? Many argue a huge percentage being devoted to the children's education. And you see that as the reason why the government comes out with a new regulation to crack down on the high-tech educational firms. Do you think it's working so far?
Well, you know, spending money on your children's education is part of consumption. So when you crack down on that sector, what you're hoping to do is to divert money from that sector to go into other consumption sectors. My understanding of the crackdown is because they're very concerned about the impact on inequality. The problem, as you know, in China is that if you're rich, you can afford to send your kids to much better training to do well in the Gaokou to get into a top university. And I think they're trying to break that because there's other measures too that they're implementing to try to make it a bit more egalitarian.
And do you think it might work?
I hope it works. I think it's certainly a good idea. I think the pressure on parents, particularly middle class and lower middle class parents, is really intense. So I'm hoping it works. The problem is that they're trying to resolve it by fixing the supply side of the problem. But it's always seemed to me that the real issue is the demand side. It's that parents really, really want their kids to do well and will sacrifice whatever for their kids to do well. So there's always going to be a demand for these types of services.
You mentioned egalitarian. It seems that word is being emphasized once again together with fairness. That has a lot to do with some of the recent policies. How much do you think the policies in the middle and long term will be able to address these issues?
It's an important question, not just for China. Inequality has become, in many ways, one of the biggest economic problems in the world. We see very high levels everywhere. And in principle, we know how to resolve it. It's quite easy. It's you transfer income from those who have a disproportionate share to those who have a low share. It's easy to say, but it's politically always very tough to do because the groups that have a disproportionate share of income, of course, are politically very powerful. So what they want is the transfers to be borne by other groups. And it's very difficult to resolve that. But the good news is that really in the last 2 to 3 years, really in China, in the US and other countries, we've been talking very seriously about inequality as a really big problem for domestic demand. And I'm hoping that countries, they'll use different steps, but they'll move in the direction of redistributing income.
However, investors, as you may know very well, many of them you are working with on a daily basis, are having concerns about what to do with the China market. On the one hand, they understand the size and the potential of this market. On the other side, they do not understand the step-by-step daily changes going on. How do you see that?
Well, there's a very big learning process.
For you too?
For all of us, because we haven't really seen this before. Remember, China had pretty strict capital controls for most of its modern history. And it's only in the last few years that they've started to eliminate the capital controls. So foreign investment in China is still very low compared to other developing countries and certainly compared to other advanced economies. But it's growing very, very quickly. And what we recently had in the last 2 weeks was a really big shock to foreign investors because they were not used to those types of policies being implemented by the government. So everyone's pulled back and they're sort of rethinking their strategies and they're trying to get a deeper understanding of what are the risks that you have to be concerned of when you invest in China. The rewards are quite good. I mean, if you look at the bond markets, Chinese government bonds yield almost 2% more than American government bonds, and probably 3% or 4% more than, or 3% more than European and Japanese bonds. That's a lot in bond land. And on top of it, the currency has been pretty stable and appreciating. So that's additional profits. So it makes a lot of sense to buy Chinese government bonds. But if you want to buy corporate bonds, you have to really understand the credit risks, which in China are political as much as they are credit. And that's more difficult to understand.
We've been talking to different walks of life to understand, particularly for our audience from outside, to understand what's going on. For example, we talked to the national security expert, and he has been suggesting that many have not noticed the dramatic change that China has put in its national plan, that development and national security become the two sole most important issues. So what we're seeing right now is the daily step-by-step adjusting toward those goals.
Right.
Your take?
Right. Well, it's important because since the reform and opening up, China's followed a very different strategy. And as it's followed that strategy, investors have become used to that strategy of continual opening up. Refocusing domestically on national development and on security issues is for most, not just foreigners, but also many Chinese investors, a very new refocus. And, you know, that's going to require institutional changes. And in such a big, complex economy like China, it's really hard to predict what those changes, how they're going to affect the markets. So basically, you learn by doing, by making mistakes. And I think that has a lot of investors nervous.
Because people were saying, oh, first of all, it's maybe Ant Financial, and then there's DD, and then there's computer games, and who knows what's next. You will hear commentators in some of the international business media outlets would say things like that. So as a seasoned analyst, how do you see comments like this, and what is your best advice?
My best advice is that if you want to invest in Chinese stocks, you have to be ready for a lot of volatility. And this is not new. Volatility has been enormous for years and years. And the volatility is not necessarily driven for fundamental reasons. In fact, it's almost never driven for fundamental reasons. It's driven for liquidity reasons, political reasons, things like that. You have to learn that system. The bond markets are quite different, or at least the government bond market, because the Chinese government bond is extremely high credit quality. And so all you have to care about is the interest rate and the currency. And I think the interest rate you can see is high. And I think it's pretty safe to say that the currency will be stable or strong for the next few years. I don't see a lot of weakness there.
On the government bond, local government bonds are becoming ever more popular. And you also see the latest economic forum talking about the future plan of allocation, the percentage of local government bonds. How do you see this potential?
Well, the problem with local government bonds is that there's very little differentiation among different provinces, even though we know that some provinces are very healthy and some provinces have really serious debt problems. And so the reason there's no differentiation is because there's this implicit guarantee from the central government. And it looks like the central government wants to slowly remove some of those guarantees. It's not telling us which it will remove and which it won't, But we can see in Huarong, we can see in Evergrande, we can see in several of the banks that they're starting to pull back their guarantees. Now that's not a credit process, that's a political process. So in order to judge it, you have to be able to judge the politics. So I think foreign investors are very nervous about provincial government bonds. They prefer central government bonds. And some of them are starting to play with high yield bonds in China because there are some high yields. But they have to understand again that you don't do typical credit analysis on these companies. Whether Evergrande fails or not is not a question of assets versus liabilities. It's a question of whether the government believes, whether the regulators believe an Evergrande failure will be too destabilizing to the market.
The other thing is about the Central Economic Forum that just wrapped up a few days ago. What do you see as the most important policy lines in that statement?
Well, to me, there's this real undercurrent of debate taking place in China about the economy. And you can broadly break it up into two groups. One group is very worried about the rise in debt. So you get these constant references by the central bank, by the banking regulators, the CBIRC, and by other people on the regulatory side who are warning about the need to bring debt under control. The other group is very worried about slowing growth. And so they're warning that we need to keep stepping on the accelerator and speed growth up. Now, the problem is that those are two completely conflicting strategies. You cannot, without a growth in debt, growth in China, economic growth in China probably wouldn't be more than 2 to 3%. So if you want growth rates higher than that, you need the debt burden to get worse. If you want the debt burden to stop getting worse, you have to accept lower growth rates than that. And I don't think that debate has been resolved. I think that there still is a great deal of argument about that. I think for now, those who are more concerned about debt have slightly the upper hand. But what we've seen in the past is that when they get the upper hand and growth starts to slow, then you get policymakers get very nervous about growth, and then you start to see a debt pick up and growth pick up again. That's something that has to be resolved, and I don't think it has been resolved yet.
It did mention about carbon. Of course, many believe it could be one of those drivers. How realistic do you think people should be about that possibility?
Well, you know, the comparison is with, say, the US in World War II. War turned out to be very good for the economy. And so people say if we have a war on environmentalism, on issues of the environment, in a sense, a kind of war where we spend huge amounts of money in order to resolve, in order to beat this particular enemy, this could be really good for the economy. The problem with that thinking is that there are cases under which it's good for the economy. You have to remember that when the US entered World War II, it had gone through the biggest depression in its history. It had huge levels of unemployment and huge levels of unutilized resources. And so it was able to transfer all of that towards the war without significantly undermining the economy. China doesn't have a huge amount of unutilized capacity, doesn't have high levels of unemployment. So a serious environmental fight might actually also, in the short term, reduce the growth rate. In the long term, it would be good for everybody. But in the short term, it could have adverse economic consequences.
So what we're having now is a lot of things at different directions, right? You've got the geopolitics, you've got the pandemic, you've got people thinking about what's going to be the future driver of the economy, carbon, for example. So how do you see the policymakers in China are trying to reconcile all of these possibilities, and how do you read the final statement, for example, for the latter half of the year on the economic conference?
You can't even predict COVID. And if you can't predict COVID, you can't predict anything else. And so even if that were the only problem, it would be a mess. But it's not the only problem. There's lots of other problems, and it's very, very hard to figure out which way to go.
Moving on to the China-US relations, you've been working on analyzing the Chinese economy, China-US trade for a long time. How do you read the future for the rest of the year, at least, in terms of China-US trade interactions?
Well,
We got some beautiful birds chirping.
Yes.
I hope it's a good sign.
Well, that should be good for the interview, right? Chirping
Yes.
birds. The issue for trade, I think, is there are two important points that I would make. The first point is that everybody looks at the U.S.-China conflict because it's the best show in town. It's the most exciting show. But I think it's a really big mistake to see this global problem as a U.S.-China conflict. As I see it, there are conflicts all over. There are, within Latin America, within North America, in Europe, in China, among Chinese neighbors, etc. There's a lot of conflict. And I think that this shouldn't come as a surprise. In my 2013 book, I said this had to happen. As we were in a period of what Danny Roderick calls hyperglobalization, we were going to start to see a retreat from that as the costs of globalization mounted, one of which is this severe income inequality. And as we retreat from it, historically, global political tensions always rise. And so I'm not surprised that they've risen, and I don't think they're going to go away. I think it would be useful if we place less attention on the US-China relationship and just recognize that we have bad relationships. Everybody has bad relationships with everybody right now. It's really, really difficult to see how this gets resolved quickly. And I don't think it's going away. I think we have at least 2 or 3 more years of geopolitical tensions, of unhappiness. That's the bad news. The good news is that in the US, the new program by the Biden administration, I hope will be very successful, and there'll be 2 components to it. First is significant investment in American infrastructure, which the US definitely needs. And secondly, by increasing demand, businesses in the US are also increasing investment significantly. This is already happening. Now, if investment rises significantly in the US in the next 6 months, the next 12 months, that means that the US trade deficit will be balanced not by low savings, but by high investment. And that's the good way of balancing it. Low savings is the bad way of balancing it. So I think in that case, we'll see rapid growth, and people will focus less on the trade deficit as a big problem. It'll only be temporary, but at least for 6 months, a year, 2 years, the trade deficit will become less of an issue.
But now if you look at the US economy, it seems that it's not doing as well as earlier expected. The CPI up, the growth rate down, not to mention some of the other numbers. So with the US economy reality like that, will there be even sharper conflict between China and the United States? As we know, there's a lot of politics behind this.
Right. The politics and the security issues and things like that, I can't really comment on. I have no expertise there. I don't think that's going away. I think that's going to be around for a while. My focus is on economic conflicts. And I believe, maybe I've read too much Marx, but I believe that economic conflicts are at the heart of other types of conflicts. So if we resolve that, that sort of reduces a lot of the other tensions. And there, I think that there can be a temporary relief of the economic conflict if we see explosion in investment.
Many of the people that we talked to over the past half a year have been quite optimistic at the very beginning of the Biden term, both about its policies on China-US relations and also on the revival of the US economy. But over the months, we see that number has been going down. But you seem to be quite stubborn, still standing over there.
Yeah, we call it the honeymoon. This happens with every president.
We haven't seen the honeymoon.
Well, the honeymoon is the initial period
of course,
where you're very excited, everything looks good, and then reality sets in, and you realize that there's no such thing as good without costs. There's always some distribution of costs and benefits. And as the costs start to be distributed, you start to get a great deal of unhappiness. But so far, I think the economy looks good. The key is Congress, the politics. If they can get through the infrastructure bill, then I think that leaves the U.S. in a very strong position. Because let's face it, U.S. infrastructure is pretty bad. And improving U.S. infrastructure is almost a free lunch. It will have a much better impact on the economy than a cost.